Hello, art historians, and welcome to our second part of the High Italian Renaissance. So we had the context, which doesn't really count as part of the actual looking at the art. And then we did part one, which was over Da Vinci, and now part two, we're going into Michelangelo. But before we do that, I really want to make sure we look back to the title slide of this particular lecture series, and that is the fact that it is beauty above all else for the High Italian Renaissance. And that doesn't mean just painting a picture of a beautiful subject or a beautiful moment or a beautiful event. It means creating a work of art that in itself is truly beautiful and demonstrates the ability of these artists to show their capability as humans and to understand the world around them and to be at the same level as God, because they were now to the level of being able to truly create works of art with freedom and deciding what they felt was beautiful and how works of art should look. So when we looked at Da Vinci, one of the things that we looked at was the fact that in terms of beauty, he found it in how the eye sees things. He's very big into geometry and making sure things are balanced and mathematical and also very human at the same time. Remember, the Last Supper is very, very human in terms of how everybody in the scene is actually reacting to such a moment. And now we're going to move into Michelangelo. And Michelangelo would have been a contemporary of Da Vinci. He's actually going to outlive Raphael and Da Vinci and will live long enough to watch his own style go out of taste. Eventually, people will kind of move on from his own style. But what we need to understand about Michelangelo is his view of what is beautiful in terms of art is very, very different from what we're going to see with Da Vinci and even Raphael to an extent, who was kind of a borrower and would kind of take influence from Michelangelo. Either the two were rumored to have really not liked each other a whole lot. So Michelangelo, like Da Vinci, was also a Florentine. He was kind of there in the midst of all of this rise of the Medici. And in fact, if there had been no Medici, there probably wouldn't have been Michelangelo, because his mother could not really afford to take care of Michelangelo. So he went and lived with basically what would have been his nanny or his nursemaid, and her husband was a stonecutter. And so he kind of got involved in learning the family business as a stonecutter. But he wanted to go more than that. Instead of just being a mason, he really started to see the art and the possibility in what he was doing. And the Medici basically discovered Michelangelo, and he was raised with the Medici in terms of their love of, excuse me, my lights just went out. Let me fix that. That's fun. He was raised to kind of have their influence of mythology and looking back at the Greek and Roman classics and very much that Greek and Roman style. And one way you can kind of tell it's Michelangelo is you almost wouldn't know sometimes that you're looking at a religious scene, because it really looks like it could have been something straight out of Greek and Roman mythology. So that influence of being raised by the Medici and their love of classical, true classical Greek and Roman sculpture is really going to be a big influence on Michelangelo as an artist. Okay. So just to kind of go through some of the more famous works of Michelangelo, which aren't going to be covered, that video kind of shown some of those. But I do want to emphasize that if you looked at things like the David that he worked on, you can definitely see that he was trained in the school of art put together by the Medici, who believed that understanding of the classical past and knowing their mythology and knowing their stories kind of showed a high level of intelligence. So therefore, they kind of insisted on their artists learning the same things. So what we're going to see here with him is that in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, that idea of, so this is that Neoplatonism that we've talked about before, which is how do you make the ideas of the classical Greek and Roman past work with this idea of Christianity? How do you make it work? So Michelangelo thought that the body was incredibly beautiful, and he did a lot of autopsies on cadavers to actually make sure that he could master his craft. And if he was going to show the body, he wanted to make sure he showed it as accurately as possible. But he also believed that the body holds the soul. So how do you get away with showing all of these scenes that basically make Adam and Eve look like they are Greek and Roman gods and goddesses? And how do you justify the nudity that he's going to use even on the Sistine Chapel? And the way that he got away with it was by saying the body is what holds the soul. So therefore, the soul is, the more powerful the soul is, the more it's going to be bursting out of the body. Like it's just going to be bulging and ready to bust forth. And therefore, the body should show that with bulging muscles and beauty for this basically sacred vessel that holds the soul. So it's going to be very dynamic and strong. And basically, if everybody, even the women, look like they could break you in half, it's a pretty good way to tell it's a Michelangelo. So he is going to be known for quite a few famous works of art that the 250 did not include on it for the AP Art History curriculum. This one included that he actually was the designer of the Medici tomb, which if you didn't know it was a Christian tomb, you would probably think it had something to do with Greek and Roman mythology, which it kind of does because you can see the classical design on it. And then at the same time, you have the God and goddess of night and day here. So one is turned away, one is looking forward, kind of symbolizing the death and the raising of, the new life after death. So this is just the Medici tomb that you can see here, all designed by Michelangelo, including the sculptural program that is within it. And this is a quote about Michelangelo, that one of the ways he's able to achieve this realistic depiction of the human body is he studied every known animal and did many human dissections that outnumbers that of who are in the professional fields. Like he did more dissections than the medical community had. And this is why when you look at the works of art that he does, he masters every muscle, every bone, every tendon. In fact, the David, when I show it to you, at one point, he's holding the sling over his shoulder, and you can see the bones in the top of his hand and in the top of his foot and how perfectly they are sculpted into it. Michelangelo would have greatly differed from Leonardo da Vinci because da Vinci considered painting to be the true way to capture the human soul. Like you can actually do that through his works like the Mona Lisa. Michelangelo didn't agree. He would say that you're more closer to the divine if you can take a block of marble where there was nothing and find the image within it. Like basically you create like a god. And as a result of that, Michelangelo preferred to be called the divine Michelangelo because he viewed what he was creating was godlike in what he was doing. And even when he paints, Michelangelo was not a painter. He didn't want to be a painter. He would do it, but even his paintings look sculptural, like almost like he carved them out of paint whenever he created it. So he would actually go through different pieces of rock and marble and find just the right one that had the sculpture within it, and he would free it from that. So he believes that just kind of taking this Greek idea of perfection of the body, that humans should strive to be godlike. Michelangelo believed that humans already were godlike, and therefore if their soul is perfect, then the body should reflect that, which again looks like every single person in his sculptures didn't skip leg day ever because their arm day or back day, they're just incredibly ripped from head to toe. So you have this combination of he is very religious. He's very devout. He may have struggled with the fact that, keeping it from the church, that he actually probably was homosexual. So struggling with that inside the fact that he's working for the church, but also finding beauty in the body, both male and female. We can see that kind of come out through the way that he sculpts the bodies to be so beautiful. And one of the things, whereas Da Vinci, and this is an important distinction, Da Vinci was very big on creating a very natural appearance to everything that he did. Like, it needed to look as lifelike as he could possibly get it, so that you can also, to the point of capturing the soul within it. He didn't think that nature was perfect. He's like, nature isn't perfect. So therefore, if we're going to strive for perfection, both me as an artist and what I'm painting, I'm not going to make it look natural. It's going to be definitely how I see things to be beautiful. So if you look at some works, we've got a sketch, a sculpture, and then part of the painting of the Last Judgment on the back wall of the Sistine Chapel. You can see here that making it Michelangelo is muscular. So put those M's together to remember him. Muscles, movement, and a moment. Like, that is so important, that Michelangelo's work doesn't really paint like a stagnant scene. He's always painting something in the moment, capturing that human emotion of what is happening in that scene. And you can definitely see that on the top scene with the Last Judgment of the people being cast down to hell. But at the same time, there is that muscular perfection. You know, everybody is strong and jacked, basically. So the idea being that you are strong enough to do God's work. Like, the more important you were, the more muscular you were, the stronger you were. And you had to be, because you had to be strong enough to carry on God's work, to hold up to the values that he put before you. You had to be strong enough to lift God's message and fit for God. Like, you basically, not just fit, but fit, like absolutely murderously jacked. All right. And it's almost like everything he paints, and I read this somewhere and I thought it was beautifully stated, that it's almost like the soul is busting out through all of these muscles. Like, it's constantly trying to free itself from this earthly body. Maybe that came from the idea that he was freeing the soul of something from the rock as he was carving it. So maybe it's that same idea, that he's freeing the soul of a sculpture from the rock, and our souls are trying to break free from our bodies. Now, there is also a theory, this is a theory, we don't know for sure, that Michelangelo may also have been manic depressive, or may have been bipolar. And one of the things that we see with this is he tends to have an obsession with opposites in his work, and we do see that show up quite a bit, where you'll see night and day, and the divine and the earthly, the good and the evil. But that's just a theory. We do know, though, that there are a lot of contrasts and opposites in his work. So if you take an example that everybody knows of Michelangelo, and that's the Pieta, and a Pieta is that idea of pity, that humanist idea that first appeared at the end of the Middle Ages, where we'd never seen this before, where you never had felt bad for Mary before, because Mary knew the sacrifice she was going to make. She was resigned to it. Mary always looked very strong and, you know, just kind of accepting of what had happened to her son. But this idea that her sacrifice was just as great because she did give birth to a son. And they mentioned it in the video that she actually distinguished it to make Mary look bigger than Jesus, even though he would have been 33 and quite a bit bigger than her. That idea that this is very human reaction to a woman losing her child. She had lost her baby, basically, and realistically sculpted it to the point that, you know, you can even see the folds in her dress on the ground and the true emotion in her face. And it's not natural. In fact, she's not bigger than him. It's not how it actually would have been from nature. But he does interpret it differently. He sees it differently in terms of what is beautiful. And in this, the beauty is in her sacrifice of her son and what she has done in giving this away. So we see this idea of the tension in the muscles versus the serenity in the faces. It's that idea of from she carried him in her womb, now she lays him in the tomb, the life and the death. All right, so just kind of and I have to say, this is one of my most famous works of art that I've ever seen, and I kind of want to explain why. I'd never cried before seeing a work of art, and I'd actually seen this work of art several times before I had children. And then I had my son, and I saw this work of art and really looked at it a little bit closer. And I thought about this, that my son, from the time he was born to now he's 7 years old, it doesn't really matter. He's still my baby. And there's times I pick him up and I carry him to bed and he's, you know, kind of half falling asleep and I've got him in my arms. And when he closes his eyes and his eyelashes kind of, sweep across his cheeks, and his face is completely relaxed. And I see in that moment, and your parents do this too, I promise, they suddenly don't see a 7-year-old anymore. They just see their baby. And thinking of that as this mother who lost her child, and he's 33 years old and he's a grown man, but that's still her baby in her arms. It just really impressed me how much Michelangelo was able to capture that truly human emotion in this. Another famous work of art is definitely going to be the David, which we have seen male nude sculptures before. We have seen this in Greece repeatedly. This was how a male sculpture would look as a reminder of what was important and what was valued, and that this idea was to be as perfect as possible. But Greek sculptures were so perfect, they weren't even possible. The spear bearer, we know the proportions don't add up to the average individual. We know that the discus thrower actually isn't a physically possible pose. But what Michelangelo did different is he takes the male freestanding nude like this, and he actually does it perfectly, like anatomically perfectly, from the knuckles and the toes to the bone in the top of the hand to the way that his brow furrows in this moment of tension or fear, which is another thing that would have really been that humanist side of this, is the beauty in the fact that this is something that was scary for David. And even Donatello and his David didn't do that, because he shows it after the fact, and Donatello is standing on the head of the David, and to be honest, that statue was way more about the fact that it was naked than anything else. But this sculpture is about the look in his eyes, like he's actually capturing a moment of this person going, I could die here. Like, this could be really, really bad. And knowing that and preparing with the sling over his shoulder to go into this battle. So he's taking a moment to kind of capture that in an anatomically perfect way. Now, one of the big patrons that's going to pay for Michelangelo's work is going to be Pope Julius II, who is known as the Warrior Pope. And he was a huge commissioner of art, and what he wanted to do was basically redo the Sistine Chapel, and he wanted to do St. Peters Basilica. And Pope Julius II and a lot of the popes around this time, they came from very wealthy families. And I'm sorry to say that a lot of these popes got their positions because of bribes or because of corruption and working their way to the top, as it were. And they came from backgrounds that had a great deal of art. It wasn't like the Pope today who comes from a poor Latin American community where that is considered revered. No, these popes got their job because they had money and they could pay people off, because this was basically like being royalty over every single king in Christendom. But they had come from luxurious backgrounds. And as a result of that, if the Pope was going to live in the Sistine Chapel, or not the Sistine Chapel, excuse me, in the Vatican, with the Sistine Chapel being the building where popes are elected, he wanted to redo it in a way that represented his knowledge, his tastes, his background in art, and kind of reinforce what the papacy stood for. So the popes, and Julius included, would frequently request funds to revamp and redecorate St. Peter's Basilica, because it was an outer image of the interior person living there. It was basically a visual representation of who you are, what you stand for, what you like, how educated you are. So they would ask for the great artists of the time to do sculptures, including sculptures for their tombs. In fact, Michelangelo was hired to do the tomb of Pope Julius II, hired to do like 40 different statues on this tomb. And then basically they ran out of money, so Michelangelo quit. He's like, I'll do a couple. I'm not going to do all of them because you can't afford to pay me. And this greed, actually, and all this spending of money later on will help to spark the Protestant Reformation, when in order to fund these papal projects, the church is doing things like selling indulgences, which is you basically pay your way into a spot in heaven. So this is Pope Julius II right here. Again, he's called the Warrior Pope because he really did lead battles into taking places like Naples, and going into France. He was a huge ally of the French. He was a very, very big enemy of an earlier pope that had come right before him, whose name was Rodrigo Borgia, but he was known as Pope Alexander VI because they take that name, they take a name after they become pope. And he hated Borgia. He was like, if you ever heard of the story of the Borgias, Rodrigo Borgia basically got to be pope through bribery, and his family was very corrupt. He had children. I mean, it was nothing that a pope was supposed to be, even whenever he was a cardinal. So whenever he finally became pope, he definitely, took his place very seriously and was going to make sure that the papal palace and the Sistine Chapel was going to be a true representation of bringing back a better image of the papacy as much as possible. So again, this is Pope Julius II's tomb. This was supposed to have, like I mentioned, 40 different statues on it, but it was running out of money. So this one right here, this Moses right in the middle by Michelangelo, is one of his most famous sculptures. And of course we can tell it's Michelangelo because Moses carried a very weighty message of the 10 Commandments. And this heavy task of saving God's people. So his arms definitely show that he is incredibly built. And the different types of marble and the different colors that are put into it definitely show, like, he creates shadows through marble, which is incredible. I don't know anybody before this who could really do that. So one of the other things Michelangelo is going to be famous for, he's also an architect, an incredible architect. And Michelangelo is actually also later in his life going to be hired to finish the renovations of St. Peter's Basilica, which he did and completely undid all the work of everybody before him. But he is most famous for the dome. So the dome over St. Peter's Basilica is Michelangelo's dome. And this dome, a true Renaissance dome, a true dome, will end up becoming the influence for domes that we will see here in the Western world. Like, this was the dome standard. So like in England, St. Paul's Cathedral, our church buildings and government buildings here in the United States, like the Capitol building, all very heavily modeled off of Michelangelo's design for St. Peter's Basilica, especially the dome. So you can kind of see it here in his development. And there's the interior of it. Absolutely gorgeous. If you've been to the Vatican, I'd love to hear what standing under this is like, because I've never been. Okay, so we are going to talk now about the Sistine Chapel ceiling. All right, so obviously, if we're talking Michelangelo, everybody knows that he's most famous for the Sistine Chapel and the paintings that he did, not only on the ceiling, but the back wall. And the Sistine Chapel was around long before Michelangelo. And in terms of importance, and you can see where it's pointing to, it's a rather unassuming building. It's not very elaborate on the exterior. This is the building where popes are elected. This is where the cardinals meet and determine who is going to be the next pope. So a lot of the artworks that are around the walls already done from artists like Botticelli and Perugino were done to kind of reinforce that. So a lot of emphasis on St. Peter, and St. Peter being given the keys, because the popes are the descendants of St. Peter, like they're basically the next, father of the church, as St. Peter was. So this was a really important building with not really much going on in the ceiling, and Pope Julius II wanted to change that. So this is what Michelangelo created. And originally all he was supposed to do for this was the 12 apostles. But that was not enough for him. He was like, no, that's not good. And of course, why would the popes want the apostles on there? Because St. Peter would be in there. So kind of reinforcing the importance of St. Peter. Okay. But that doesn't really work, all right, for what Michelangelo envisioned. And Michelangelo, as you guys have probably seen in some of the things I've had you look at, was painting in a time when the New World had been discovered. And this discovery of new people, new places, and Europe finally waking up from the Dark Ages and getting into the world, he didn't want to paint a scene anymore that would only be familiar and understood to people of Europe. He's like, no, we can do better than this, because we need to spread this message farther. It needs to be understandable to everybody throughout the world. So he wanted to do something different. Now, if you look over here to the left, right, so to the left side of the screen, he started on this side. All right, so basically what he has painted is the entire story of Genesis, which is the first book of the Old Testament of the Bible. And in this story, God is creating the world. So if you start over here on the right, you can literally see the moment of creation when the crackling is happening and the moment of creation is about to start. And he goes through and he creates all the animals and he creates all the trees and the birds. And then right in the middle of it, not on accident, right in the middle of the ceiling, is the creation of man, because man is the most perfect creation according to these humanists. It truly reflects that they would be the center of everything, that they have the ability to move up or down this chain of being based on how they choose. They can rise all the way to the top to being divine and creating like Michelangelo. And then it goes this direction. He creates Eve, so she's added in. She's an important part of this too, that she's man and woman together are an important part of the story. That's a humanist idea. And then as you get farther left, closer to the altar, right, which is where judgment, the last judgment, is painted, you see people starting to make mistakes. So you see Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, they're cast out. Then you go over this way and you get the great flood where God is angry at humans. So he sends this flood to punish people. And then you see Moses, who ends up, or excuse me, not Moses, Noah, who ends up in, being a drunkard and kind of falling away from what is right. And then there's kind of the warning on the back wall of the judgment, which was painted way later, of if you don't choose the right things, then you could go to hell. But it's okay because there is a savior coming. Jesus is actually coming. And around the triangles, right? So in here, you can see prophets who told the story of the forecoming of Jesus, who is going to change all of those things. You can see family related to Jesus. And then there's the sybils, who we will talk about in a second. So the Sistine Chapel ceiling, again, was supposed to just have the 12 apostles on it. Michelangelo did not agree with that, and the popes knew that he was a genius, so they allowed him to do this. Now, it will take him 4 years, and contrary to popular belief, he did not lay on his back painting this. He did stand up, although he did experience a lot of pain in his neck and his back. And one of the reasons it took him 4 years is because he fired everybody who was working for him. Michelangelo was very temperamental, and if they weren't doing exactly what he wanted, which is very difficult to match his vision because it is so unique, he fired him. And really the only person he had left was the guy who mixed his paints. That was all. And even that guy was on the chopping block a couple of times. Now, there's actually a huge rumor, a conspiracy theory, if you will, that Raphael and Bramante were both approached. So Bramante is another artist during this time, were approached to do the ceiling because Raphael was already painting in this in the Pope's private library. He was already doing scenes in there. And Raphael and Bramante both were like, I don't want this job. I'm afraid I can't do it. I don't want that to be my legacy. I don't want this failure to be there. But they didn't like Michelangelo. So they thought, because Michelangelo was very brooding and he often insulted Raphael for being such a socialite, like he was, like focused on your art, not so much on, being so popular all the time. And so what they did is they may have gone to the Pope and said, hey, who would really like to do this ceiling? I mean, he'd love it, is Michelangelo. And so the Pope went to Michelangelo, who couldn't refuse, and then ended up turning this into one of the greatest works of art of all time, obviously. So he was given permission to basically do what he wanted. And again, he said he was going to do the story of Genesis, and everything that you can see there that looks like those triangle shapes in the corners and along the sides, that's all painted, right? That's all of it. It's called trompe l'oeil. It tricks the eye into looking like it's real, and it's not. It almost looks like it's in a classical building, right, with those shapes of triangles, like a pediment almost, or like within a pediment sculpture. So that's that classical background he got from the Medici. And because he is trained by the Medici, he is very familiar with male and female nude statues. And these are called ignudi because they are nudie and they are all over the ceiling. And if you didn't know that this was a very religious building, it would look like a Greek and Roman myth, basically. So he used that technique we have seen from artists like Van Eyck called grisaille, where they take gray paint and use it to make the appearance of statues so realistic that it almost looks like they're carved out of paint. It's just unbelievable what he was able to do. So you have, again, the 9 compartments in the middle. that tell the story of Genesis, all right, basically man's creation to their failure. But it's okay because there is going to be a savior coming. So around the outside, the perimeter of this tells the story of the forthcoming of Jesus. But the thing is, nowhere in this is, with the exception of some of the architecture that looks Greek and Roman, none of the story looks like it's taking place in Europe. It looks like it could be understood by anybody, which is important to Michelangelo because this is a bigger world now with much more different people in it. So these triangular shapes right here have ancestors of Jesus who are in it. So from his family, all right, so like his grandmother who would be in there. And this is just kind of a diagram so that you can see this, all right? And you have these heroes also in the corners who helped pave the way for Jesus to come by basically defending the faith, defending the followers of God. So David slaying Goliath, so saving the kingdom that David does. Judith slaying Holofernes, who had basically enslaved the Hebrew people. Moses raising up the bronze serpent, all right? So all of these stories. And then if you look here in the triangles, you can see Jacob and Joseph, so the descendants of Jesus. But then if you'll notice here in the peach, all right, the peach are prophets who foretold the coming of a savior, like Jonah and the whale and Isaiah, Daniel, Zechariah. And then if you look right here, the sybils, right? Sybils in ancient Greece were people who could tell the future, right? They were prophets, basically. So why is he including a Greek fortune teller in here? Like, how did he get away with this? And we'll explain that in a second. So here was the problem that Michelangelo made when he started on the ceiling. So he started out on this end by carving the later scenes in Genesis. So Noah and the flood here, which again looks nothing like it would have been an actual Christian scene because people obviously wouldn't have been naked, but they have to be naked in order for Moses to show off his idea of the body and his mastery of the body and that it holds the soul. And these are the beautiful people who are surviving the flood. They are the survivors of it. So their soul is good and just busting out of their body. But if you didn't know it was Christian, you wouldn't know any better. And that's definitely his mythological training. But you can see here the difference between this panel and then the one below it, where the figures are much bigger in the bottom. And that's because Michelangelo realized that when he did the flood, it's very hard to tell that small a detail from the floor. And rather than start it all over again, he just made the figures that much bigger as he progressed towards the other panels. And if you want to pause this, you can. This is just an example of Michelangelo's personality and his poetry that he wrote complaining about what he was doing while painting. But while you're doing that, please admire this sybil that is over here to the right. That's a woman, okay? That is a woman, and it's one of the sybils who was a fortune teller foretelling that there would be a savior coming. And if you look at her arms, she could kill you. She is incredibly jacked, she is incredibly strong, but that's because she is carrying a very weighty and important message. So she has to be strong in order to do that. Okay, so again, zooming in a little bit, you can see the little cherubs that are on there. You can see that he's used that with that grisaille or painting. And what he has done is almost bring the viewer into this scene. Like the people on the ceiling are almost three-dimensionally carved out of paint and are coming into your space. So here's another one of those sybils sitting here reading the message about that Jesus will bring and that there's going to be Jesus and there's going to be this savior. But once again, look at her arms. I mean, she carries with her a very weighty, carries with it a very weighty message. So she needs to be strong, but also look at her knees and her feet. They're almost like hanging down off the ceiling, like coming into your space, almost three-dimensional. Now, we can't go anywhere without discussing the center panel, which again is significant because it is right in the center, right? It's this idea that Adam and his birth is right here in the center of all of this because that is God's greatest creation. And Adam is kind of limp and just hanging there, lifeless, until God reaches out and gives him life, but he also is not that far away from God. And never before had we seen God actually shown and persified. And if you didn't know any better, you'd think he was Zeus, because in terms of power and, lightning and almost like that zap or that charge, that's what you would have in ancient Greece. So that's that mythology background. And then if you look, God and the figures behind him are designed in the shape of a brain. And that is that idea that God's given message to man was intelligence, and that there could be thought and brilliance and understanding of all of this. It didn't have to be this big mystery, and that God is all knowing and knew of this in his plan, and that the brain that we have is from God, and that's where our knowledge comes from. And then of course, right underneath God's arm is Eve, that she was always meant to be there, that she was originally known, that she was going to be part of this picture, no pun intended, as well. So this is the creation or the birth of Adam, all right? And everybody focuses, if they ever do a small clip of this, they do the hands, that God is actually almost on the same plane as Adam, because humans are that important. And Adam is childlike and innocent, and and God brings with him the knowledge and understanding that Adam needs to understand this world that God created for him. So again, let's talk about these sybils. All right, so the sybils on the ceiling that you see looking like this, who are carrying these very heavy messages in these books, were not from Europe, and they were not originally Christian. But there are Jewish prophets and there are sybils, and all of these are predicting that a savior is coming. So the fact that you have sybils from Libya and these other parts of the world shows, and they have them labeled, like there's one from Delphi, so the sybil of Delphi in Greece, where at Delphi people would go see the oracle at Delphi because she could tell the future. I don't know if anybody has seen The Never-Ending Story. If you have, shoot me a message, because I want to know that you've seen it. But in The Never-Ending Story, they go to see the oracles, and the oracles kind of tell them the future of what it is that they need to understand or see. So an oracle at Delphi, she could see the future in ancient Greece. So he put a figure from ancient Greece in here, very, very strong, right? Very beautiful. She's coming into your space. Her knees are sticking out. She's almost carved into the scene with paint. And she is saying that, you know what? God is coming for everybody. Libya, Greece, Delphi, all of these different sybils. They were portraying that God is coming for everyone in this world, especially now that they know that the world is bigger. And Delphi sybil is actually one of the bigger sybils that is on the ceiling. So this is one of the prophets. Again, you can see he's bringing the prophet into your space. All right, he's got the knees coming out towards you. The feet are almost dangling over, almost like they're hanging off the ceiling. Like, it's incredible what he's able to do. And right with these prophets, he used incredibly bright colors to kind of give people hope that, yes, Noah messed up, and yes, Adam and Eve messed up, but there's hope, there's brightness, there's color to be had. So here you have on the ceiling the Persian sybil, and look how bright her colors are, like meant to be like, there's brightness, there's hope, there's light. The Persian sybil over here, Cumaean, which she's the scariest one, I think, and the Libyan sybil, just these sybils that are there from different parts of the world who weren't involved in the Christian story, but are telling the story that it's coming. All right, so that's Michelangelo. We're going to stop there. And part 3 of this series, of this lecture series, we'll look at Raphael, who does take a lot of influence from both Michelangelo and Da Vinci in his designing practices.